Well, it's slightly unusual for this week's podcast with Chris Skinner because we're not on High Ash Farm. We've come a few miles south, and Chris is going to explain all, I'm sure, but we're sitting in the farm pickup, so it's a little bit of High Ash Farm, but we're now in, say it quietly, Suffolk.
We certainly are. We've just crossed the border, and I feel, first of all, I'll explain, I feel very at home here, because this is my ancestral home, where my grandfather, great-grandfather, and 3 or 4 other grandfathers in succession before them all farmed here at Bungay and in the surrounding villages. And at the moment we're sitting just across the border. Lots of dog walkers now going out onto Outney Common, which is where we are.
So this is just outside Bungay, isn't it?
Yes, we're on the extreme outskirts of Bungay, and on the other side of the A143 is the Clay's printing factory, for just on the outskirts of Bungay, a major employer here in the small town, and so I love it to bits.
Look at your bookshelf at home, and if you've got paperbacks, then, well, even hardbacks as well, look at the front where they're printed, and I wouldn't mind betting more than half of them were printed within a few yards of where we're sitting.
Lots of Harry Potter as well.
Oh, yes.
I think some of it actually appeared, or references to it, in The Devil Wears Prada, and I think one of the characters in there actually managed to wangle one of the early manuscripts out of the factory here. So it's quite famous. Anyway, my ancestral home, just at the other side of the factory, are 2 churches, St Mary's and Trinity Church there, and that's where a whole host of Skinners are buried, so lots of family connections. But we're going to walk out onto Outney Common, and I'll explain why we're here and what we can see, because I hope there's a few treats for us, although a lot of it is underwater.
Yes, because of the recent rain. Well, I hope you can stay with us as long as you possibly can for this week's Countryside podcast with Chris Skinner. And I've got some gumboots to pull on, haven't I?
Yes, you have. They've got MG written inside, so don't choose mine.
Chris Skinner's Countryside Podcast with Matthew Gudgeon.
Well, we've got the factory, the print works across the road here, and we've just come into the common a few yards, and the birds are singing as well, Chris, so there's some wildlife going on here.
Yes, there is. This is really permissive access, and lots of people are walking around just getting their morning exercise in. Yellowhammer just flew past you, just going down into the shrubbery. So we're now on Outney Common, or Bungay Common, some people call it, and it's a total of 400 acres, so it's a good old stretch of land. And what's happened here is very unusual, because right back to the history of the common perhaps goes back around 1,000 years, and sometime between then and about 200 years ago, the common got divided up into what were called goings, really unusual, and 300 people owned a going. And most of those lived in Bungay or the surrounding villages. And basically it gave you the right to graze a single or 2 animals at any point on the common land. So it was a sort of going, you'd actually pay the reeves who ran the common to actually adjudicate who was grazing where, but it's all basically open land until the late 1700s, when parts of the common were fenced in. And that's still here today, which we'll visit in a few minutes. So that's a bit of the history. So the common's 400 odd acres, divided into 2 lots of land, and we're standing on what's called the hard land, or the hards as it's called, and down the other side where the River Waveney is, there's lots of marshland there. It's grazed by cattle.
Oh, so the Waveney's down over there?
Just there. It's right next to us. It's only a few hundred yards away, and by the time we finish our walk, should be able to throw a stone into Norfolk. So I'll feel quite at home doing that.
Yes, for people who are maybe far away and listening in other countries and other parts of the country as well, the River Waveney is the historic and traditional border between the North Folk and the South Folk.
Exactly that, and the river flows right round, but here at the Common it goes round in a huge semicircle. So on the east side of the Common, the north side of the Common and the west side of the Common is the River Waveney, and Bungay sits right behind us here, and so that's why it's an ideal place for recreation. Now, we'll explain a little bit more as we go on about the goings, the hard land, the hard standing, and the lowland, and we'll go to the lowland in a few minutes' time. But on this, where we're standing, it's really gravelly soil, very acidic, and you know my love, apart from the history of a particular place, is some of the wildflowers, and we are spoilt on Outney Common. Just come here and look at this. This is what you call absolutely beautiful.
Well, these blue flowers.
It's a harebell, and it's very demure, hanging down. Now, this is where life gets very confusing sometimes. So once you go north of the border in Scotland, it's not called a harebell. Wait for it. It's called a bluebell.
But these are not bluebells.
No, not as we know them. The bluebells at High Ash Farm, which the farm's famous for, flower at the end of April, and this flowers from May right through until about the first week in November. So we're right at the end of the flowering period.
These really do look like bells, though, don't they? So maybe that name's more appropriate.
It is, yes. I can't agree more. It's the family's called Campanula, and you have garden versions of it, but none is as beautiful than this. There's the slightest breeze today, and you can see the demure little flower heads. They're almost transparent. If I lift one of the little bells up, Matthew, you can almost see my fingers through the tiny petals.
Yes.
There's 5 little star-like petals and a stigma underneath there pointing downwards, and the little plants then produce seed in these tiny little pods, which you can see there. And I think it's one of our most beautiful wildflowers of all. I don't like to sort of say that, but there's something really special about it, very demure.
And it's here in profusion, right next to a big briar patch here.
Yes, there's brambles there, and there's a good healthy crop of brambles, and that's why we saw some of the finches flying over the top of us. And still, because parts of the common were mown during the summer months, that encouraged some of the flowers around us to do a second flowering, and this is yarrow, Achilles milfolium, and it's called milfolium just because I nearly picked a thistle leaf then by mistake. If I take one of the little leaves off, you can see how it gets its name. Mil just means 1,000, so it's a plant with 1,000 leaves.
That looks like a fern leaf,
doesn't it, in
yes. Miniature.
And it's a little flat umbral of a flower head as well, and they're all about a foot tall, whereas these harebells are only 200 mil tall at the most, about 8 inches in old money. But nevertheless, it just makes my day when I see these, because I'm quite jealous because I haven't got them on the farm, and yet it's as the ideal habitat for them. Acidic, dry soil. I have actually seen them growing on the dunes at Winterton around the Norfolk coast there. They just love sandy soil, so they won't like some of the clays at High Ash Farm or down in South Norfolk where you get the heavy land. It just likes this heath type land, which is really, really special and very important for them. Beautiful.
Well, we're going to carry on our walk on Outney Common at Bungay, just into Suffolk. We're having an away day with Chris Skinner on this week's Countryside podcast. And if you have written in to Chris, we've got some letters to read out a little later, so stay tuned.
Yes, yeah, we'll get through some of the questions if we can. Matthew, look here, just alongside of the footpath here, which goes around the common, the remnants of a fly agaric. It looks as though something's been eating it, like a badger, or even hares will have a nibble at it. And it's past its best, but it's got that bright red cap. And there should be, if I can lift it up, it's been broken off already. It's beginning to shrivel up.
This is a giant toadstool. It's one of
Yes.
the bigger ones I've seen.
Yes, there they are, the gills underneath spreading the spores. And it was, perhaps a week ago, bright scarlet red in colour with a sort of white dots on. It's kind of a veil once it first emerges over the top of it. And it's one of those fungi that causes quite severe hallucinations if you happen to eat it, and it's also toxic as well. You can get violently ill. In fact, if you eat too many of them, it can be fatal. But it's really typical of where it's growing, in amongst these birch trees. Birch trees as far as the eye can see. So parts of the common, although it should be open land, have now become wooded. And the wooded area surrounds the golf course, which is out in the centre.
All these trees are quite youngish, really, aren't
They all are. They're about 15 to 25 years old, somewhere in that age bracket. But that's nice when you're out walking and trying not to talk too much. You can keep your eyes open as you're walking along. It's just amazing at this time of the year, just as we get into November. Morning. How many different species of fungi that you can actually see, and some of them are absolutely spectacular. I've seen cobalt blue coloured fungi here on previous years when I've walked through the common, and in the spring as well there's quite a flush of fungi in the spring months, because visited for Radio Norfolk in recent years, and there's kingfisher nesting quite close to where we are, just on the banks of the Waveney, which is only 100 yards or so away from where we're walking. So let's just cross over now onto, instead of the high ground, onto what's called the lows. And I said I was quite at home in this area of Bungay because my grandfather farmed just over here in front of us. Sorry, my great-grandfather, I should say, Samuel Skinner, farmed at Ditchingham, just on the other side of the river there, the River Waveney. And he grazed all these marshes right here in front of us. Absolutely, about 250 acres. They're still grazed today, and it's fenced in now. It's grazed by the Crickmore dairies, and so very, very popular. And the poor cattle have been hugged up against the fences. The only high ground is where the river was dredged, and the ground's a bit higher right beside the river, and the poor cattle are standing there up to their hocks in water this morning, so it does amuse me.
Well, we've had so much rain the last week, and it is damp and dank here today, but
Yes.
the rain has relented.
Yes, it has, and gradually the water on all these water meadows is draining away. If we walk on a bit further, we should see out into the proper lows where the cattle are grazing, and it suddenly transforms from beautiful old marshland, which is water meadows, absorbing all that water, which is exactly what they're meant to do. It's us that builds in the water table areas that are likely to get flooded, and the marshes aren't to blame at all. They're doing their job, and yet the habitat changes from grassland habitat with all the invertebrates there. Suddenly, in 24 hours, it becomes a wetland habitat, and there's mute swans, herring gulls, and all sorts of wet bird-loving species out there that love the wetlands, and suddenly it changes almost overnight, and that's how adaptable nature is.
We're at Outney Common, on the border between Norfolk and Suffolk, and you mentioned the Crickmores.
Yes.
It's a marvellous story, that, because they imported a herd of cattle that produce in France the best brie,
Of course.
and they make it here now, and it's really authentic, and I think
Yes.
they're outdoing the French.
Yes, I think it's called Baron Bigod, isn't it?
I think, by God, or
by God,
Bigod,
or Bigod
yeah.
by God, I think.
Yes,
Yes,
and that cheese is magnificent.
It absolutely is. Yes, it almost pours out of the pack when it's ripe, and it's a favourite of mine. Absolutely nectar from the gods.
Well, Chris, I mentioned that we've had quite a bit of correspondence to the podcast, and that's marvellous, isn't it? Because we want to hear more and questions and comments and everything going on. But Nigel Harvey, thank you for your note. He says, "Hi, Chris. Your mention of pan tiles in the last episode reminded me of, as a boy, as I used to climb onto an old pan tile roof and observed tiny pinhead-sized black conical snails in little pits in the surface. I always thought they made the pits and the cups by circular motion. I was amazed that they would be there on a south-facing roof that would get frying hot." And Nigel says that's just a memory from boyhood.
Oh yes, and a lovely memory too. I used to climb on roofs at the farm, and my mother would pull her hair out and say, "Christopher, would you come down off there?" So I know exactly what you mean, and I'm really pleased you could see the lichen up on the roof. But the snails, pinhead-sized snails, are a total mystery to me, and I'm always willing to learn, because on a hot day, you're quite right in your observation, I don't think that snails, which are very prone to dehydration, whether they're large snails or these pinhead-sized ones, could actually survive. That's the marvellous thing about the lichen growing on the roofs, that the fungus on the top of the lichen protects the algae underneath, and so they have a symbiotic relationship. But as for other invertebrates living on there in the heat of the day, I'm scratching my head, and so some of the questions we get I cannot answer, and I don't know what species they are.
So it's back over to our wonderful listeners to tell us what they think of Nigel's proposition.
Yes, pinhead-sized black conical snails. Amazing.
Proof we're on wetlands here.
Yes.
This is what should happen if there's a lot of rain. Then these are the areas that are flooded, not sadly people's homes.
Yes, exactly what they're meant to be doing. These water meadows, water just flowing away, and gradually they're draining down. But the water, importantly, goes down deep into the soil, the aquifer, and that's where some of the water from the taps in Bungay actually comes from. These water meadows, it's like an underground reservoir. Just before we go over this slippery stile, Matthew, just look at the other side. Some of the gorse is already in flower. Look.
Well, yes, yellow flowers.
Yes, yellow flowers.
So that's unseasonable, is it?
Yeah, it is a little bit. It's very early. I'm going to go through the barbed wire gap here.
All right, I think I will as well. The style looks a little bit...
Two birds come to mind, duck or grouse.
Wow, this is really flooded here. I'm glad I've got these Wellington boots on.
Yes, look at this. We are walking through water. But...
not walking on water.
just look at this.
Oh, lovely carpet of blue here.
Yes, all the way around us and ahead of us. How beautiful is that? It should have a more spectacular name than what it has. It's called Devil's Bit Scabious.
Devil's Bit Scabious.
Yes. It's one of the scabious family. We have scabious growing on the farm, but not this particular one. And it got its name because normal field scabious is knee-high or even above. And this one's only, 7 or 8 inches tall. And it's got a kind of dwarf rootstock. And history has it that the devil got so jealous of the beauty of this flower and its healing properties, because it could heal scabies, a skin disease in humans, that he got so cross with the plant that he bit the root and it never grew back properly. And that's why you have this dwarf, beautiful, beautiful cobalt blue flower in front of us. It's stunningly beautiful. Absolutely love it.
Loves having its feet in the water, by the look of it.
Yes, so that's one of the characteristics that it likes, because I've got no waterlogged soil like this at High Ash Farm. And so it is it's really at home here. It likes its feet in water, right on the edge of banks and dikes, and so it's really, really at home. I just love it. It's so beautiful, and because this part of the common was mown during July and early August, it's quite all right to do that, to keep parts of the common open. You can already see some birches regenerated down there, some scrub oak as well, that it's absolutely thriving, and it's going to flower well into November, so it's got a good long flowering period, ideal for autumn moths and any bees that might be feeding on it when it's a little bit warmer.
We've had a note from Gillian. Hello, Gillian Handyside. Thanks for the nice comments about the podcast. And Gillian heard you last week in a wider discussion speaking about glyphosate and that practice of using it. And I mean, several countries, she points out, have banned the glyphosate because it does harm to wildlife. You were talking about it being spread from drones.
Yes, because the moorland areas you cannot get on there with agricultural machinery. So the alternative is to spray with an aeroplane, which is not really appropriate. And drones can fly just a few metres above. You've got your pilot sitting on the edge of the area going to spray, and he'll control the drone, and they can spray a hectare at a time at the moment. They begin to carry quite large loads, and glyphosate has carcinogenic properties, or it's reputed to have. There's been lots of lawsuits over in the United States about its use over there, and so it is used as a kind of desiccant and controlling difficult weeds on farmland. It's still used today. Some farmers don't use it just pre-harvest in case there's any residues left. It's used to help ripen cereal crops as well. So a lot of controversy about it, and I just mentioned it because one of the finalists in the Farming Today Awards was talking about drone technology and the ability to spread seed on moorland and then to spray glyphosate onto bracken to kill it down, and then the bracken dies down on top of the grass seeds, all wildflower seeds even, and then that forms like a seed bed without cultivating the soil.
Gillian says that's an alarming prospect.
Yes.
But is it really going to happen?
I'm not sure, but they're doing trials on it already, and it does worry me when you change technology from a long proven track record of agricultural production, which has had its problems. We've used DDT in the past, we've used lots and lots of chemicals. The Eldrin one for dressing corn, mercuric oxide was another one which I was brought up with, a red dust which if you heated it up you get little drops of mercury, highly toxic, and we have tried to improve our health and safety on the farm and also through the chemicals we're using, but this might be a step too far, and as always with gene technology which is being advanced rapidly at the moment, there's always big questions to ask. What happens if things go wrong with it? You cannot grab back if you've let genes out or sprayed areas that should be left as nature has intended them, and you have great difficulty in reversing the damage that you unwittingly do. So there we are. It's a huge area. It's way past my brief. I'm a wildlife enthusiast. I'm not an expert, but I do have very strong feelings about some of the ways that we're looking after our world at present, and it concerns me a lot.
Well, that all seems a long way away as we're standing here in the Waveney Valley in Suffolk and enjoying this marvellous heathland that's such an amenity to people in the Bungay area.
Yes.
And we'll slosh our way through here.
Yes, I can see some yellow flowers on the other side here. There's a bit of deep water to cross, so I hope it's not over the top of our wellies.
Oh,
so
my goodness.
Don't fall over. We're now in 8 inches of water, and I think we should be okay. I'm not sure what they are. It's not ragwort, which can flower at this time of
I
year.
can see some yellow flowers.
Yes, and yeah, we're now coming up to some deep water, Matthew. Lots of worms dead at the bottom of the water.
They're drowned worms?
They're drowned, yes.
Oh, lots of them?
Lots,
Hundreds?
yeah, yes. The oxygen's gone out of the worm burrows, and sadly they're all just underneath the water. Hundreds of them.
Well, when the water goes down, the birds will find those, presumably?
Of course, they're finding them already, just on the other side here, on the lows, where the cattle are grazing this morning.
I can hear the cattle lowing.
Yes, yes. And that's why they're called the lows. There they are, there's the cattle.
Ah.
And the whole of that in front of us was covered in water. Now, it's not ragwort. Oh, wow. Look at this. It's beautiful. It's a relative of flax. So let's have a little close look at one of them. It's called, let's see which one it is. Yep, it's called common toad flax. Now, two names there, toad and flax. Flax has very long, narrow leaves like this, all the way up this stem. So part of the scientific name is Linearia. And toad, because of the shape of the flowers. Now, if you get, it's in full flower at the moment, if you get your little hand and just squeeze, the little mouth should open up like a toad's mouth. And this one isn't. And that's where you get, that's better. There you are.
Yes.
Look, it looks like a toad's mouth. So toad flax.
These are so beautiful, though,
They
aren't
are, and it's so easy. If I hadn't spotted them, we'd have carried on walking and talking.
The middle of them are very intensely yellow, beautiful yellow, and then there's a lighter pastel-y yellow round.
Yes.
And they're small as well, they're
Yes.
petite little wild flowers.
Linearia vulgaris. So vulgaris just means common or field plant, and there's nothing common about that. We've already seen those harebells, which I said are exquisitely beautiful, and I think this has to be a close second, particularly at this time of the year, on the edge of November, and it's just stunningly beautiful, and it's all along this bank. So they haven't quite had their feet in water. I've now got wet knees, but they're prolific seed producers. You can see some just on the higher ground, and this in fact is the old River Waveney before it was actually dredged out a few hundred yards that way.
So this really is the...
This is like a dike
Yes.
now, but the water's flowing through there at walking
It's
pace.
only about 10, 12 feet across. isn't
Yes, so that's the old river, it's called, and that the other side you can see a fence that keeps the cattle in. That's the lows, and that's the area that my grandfather farmed, and he built a wooden bridge from Ditchingham across the new river, which is where the River Waveney currently is, and eventually that got washed away in some earlier floods, and the Reeves and my great-grandfather got together and they built a cast iron bridge which you can walk over today, and there's a little plaque at the bottom there saying how the bridge arrived, and it's still there today. And so sort of, as you walk across the bridge, you go from Suffolk, if you're on Outney Common, to Norfolk in 12 strides. That's where the old boundary between the two counties is. Just love it to bits.